Now, Americans talk about news cycles, and that means, or that speaks to rather, the very short time frame that Americans occupy. They live in the moment. If something doesn't happen right away, well, why didn't it happen? It's a failure. Whereas the Russians prosecute a war not according to the news cycle every day. They're in it for the long haul. They want to win.
This is the Friends of History Debating Society. I'm Gaius, and Germanicus is here. We're in Londinium. It is a beautiful late summer afternoon. In Londinium, it is 91 AD. The centurions are still here, running back and forth, carrying bundles for their wives and children. Retired centurions. They served the legion and tell great stories. We're sitting by the Thames, enjoying our cup of wine and reflecting philosophically on lessons learned from the Roman Empire. We're very far from the trouble in Rome. There's always trouble in Rome. We're not senatorial. We're not looking for trouble. We're just philosophers. We don't write things down because you never know. We do talk, however. And right now, the subject is the great success that we witnessed in the 21st century by the Democratic National Convention to develop a story that gives great entertainment to the people in the convention hall in Chicago, 23,000 we're told, and to the Democratic Party across the country watching, and to anyone who appreciates political theater, as we Romans do. The Circus Maximus and the Colosseum were about entertaining to demonstrate authority and that the gods love us. And that was an entertainment. Germanicus, a very good day to you. The entertainment that we witnessed with the nomination of Kamala Harris, Vice President of the United States, to be the new emperor, the new president of the United States, was managed with precision. And the applause at the end was heartfelt by the people in the room, in that vast chamber, and the people at home. And that is a good step towards claiming the throne. I understand it can appear that Kamala Harris is inheriting the throne, but really you do have to demonstrate that you have skills such as Circus Maximus. And in our time, the emperors who did have those skills had advantages over those who did not. How do you measure how the Democratic National Convention will use this established success? Where do they go next in the days left till the vote? Good evening to you.
Their success was necessary, and therefore they put all of their energy, every ounce of their understanding of how to present the essential ritual of acclamation, which is the foundation of legitimacy for the succession of any new Roman emperor. So the arrangement of the ritual had to serve several purposes in Chicago, just as it has had to do for hundreds of years in our Imperium Romanum. And as a result, it built off the time-tested elements of successful rituals of acclamation. The first is, as you mentioned, entertainment. In other words, it has to invigorate the pulse and the heart and do all the things that entertainment does. And the mind is a distant third or fourth or fifth. And therefore, when emperors, as we all know, each new emperor must create a ritual context, a giant celebration, a huge imperial ceremony that is held in the place of acclamation, usually the Circus Maximus or the Hippodrome later in Byzantium, in Constantinople, because the Roman Republic was built on succession and conferral of legitimacy through acclamation from the Senate and the people of Rome. So the Senate and the people always acclaimed the new emperor all the way up until the last days of Byzantium in the 15th century. And it was done at a place where the city could meet, and that would be the Circus Maximus, at least in imperial times. And what new emperors would always be sure to do is to have an extra rich annona, meaning distribution of grain and bread, of fish, of olive oil, and most importantly, of wine. And so people were in a good, happy mood. And the ecstatic mood in Chicago is built on promises of great entertainment. One of those promises being Beyonce, which was a false promise because she did not show up, nor was she scheduled. In other words, there was a lot of hype in order to inflate the ceremonial joy that needed to be created. And this, however, I must caution, is only a first step. It isn't the fullness of legitimacy in the sense that Roman emperors had to have a program. They had to have a set of promises that they would fulfill. And that was done very poorly. In spite of the entertainment success, the rollout of promises was something of a failure that fell flat, even among other blue optimates, like the Washington Post, for example, that criticized her wage and price controls. And the other issue that I think the convention dealt with effectively, apart from the acclamation, was to turn the character flaws, if we can call them that, of Ms. Harris, the things that people liked least about her, the things that set their teeth on edge, that most annoyed them or irritated them, her cackling, her unrestrained laughter, her general comportment had to be turned around. And they could not, which is to say the handlers of Ms. Harris, the courtiers at the top in the imperial palace, they could not suddenly remake or transform her. So what they did is they used what she was and transformed it from something really infuriating and annoying and unworthy into something that people who were the main constituents and main targets of the acclamation could embrace, and embrace joyously. Hence the endlessly repeated litany of joy, 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 happy, happy, joy, joy.
Germanicus is Michael Vlahos. I am John Batchelor Gaius, and we're observing, with the possible exception of where next, we're observing a success for the Democrats. We're going to move now immediately to the larger canvas of the battlefields of Eurasia, because while the Democrats and the Republicans are carrying on as if those wars we'll get to later, they're immediately afresh in our presence because we're Romans and we take seriously missiles flying and drones flying and attacks and cities falling. And the Kremlin, you bet, the Kremlin cares a great deal about strength. And we're looking at the Eurasian wars, especially the Ukraine-Russian war, because over these last days, the story is that the Kremlin is not going to counterattack in the Kursk salient. It's going to treat it as the way it was put in the Telegraph. I only have this in English, the new normal. However, there is a consideration that we Romans pay a great deal of attention to. It's called strength. Right now, there's a headline, for example, from the Telegraph in London. Putin's popularity falls after Kursk invasion, says Kremlin-linked poll. You bet. Germanicus, strength is what Russia demands in the emperor. Strength is what we demand in the Roman emperor. And the Roman emperors who have not matched our expectations are on a short fuse to Hades. We know this, so do the emperors, which is why Domitian was so keen to show strength. Looking back over the Julian-Claudian reign, they were always eager to show strength right away. That's why Claudius, for heaven's sakes, invaded Britain. He doesn't get much credit for it, but at the time he did. He took the the fundamentals of the invasion done by Germanicus, Caligula, and then invaded London and captured it. And it was credited. And Domitian, I think he sent a general all the way to past the Firth of Forth. And they didn't stay long, but they demonstrated strength. And Putin is not showing strength. What is he going to do about it?
The worst use of the word existential, I should say the worst misuse of the word existential, has been during the course of this war. And it has been used and bandied about as though it was nothing more than an attitude and not a reality. And so what we have seen is the West and Western media approaching a strategy for the war as though it was a public relations, quote unquote, strategy, as though an ad agency simply had to come up with a good campaign, another military term, that would somehow win the war if enough people were persuaded. And the United States government has prosecuted its proxy war on the basis of informational victories, which is to say propaganda victories, or again, not so different from the Chicago Convention we were talking about, a victory of enthusiasm, of joy. And so the entire conduct of the Ukraine war has been mutually focused by Ukraine and the West on increasing enthusiasm and on the expectation, the joyful expectation of victory. And Ukraine did this for a pragmatic reason. They didn't have a way to win against Russia militarily, but they could win economically and politically by getting enough money and enough Western support that they could inevitably wear Russia down over time and be finally embraced into the bosom of NATO. Now, Russia is different. Russia is more like Romans. And you mentioned that Romans look to strength, and absolutely, that is their lodestar. But the Romans also knew over time, because Romans were very steeped in their own traditions. They had little figurines of the ancestors in the atrium of any well-to-do Roman home. So they revered their ancestors, and they knew all about their ancestors' battles, and therefore they knew all about their defeats. And the Romans knew that being impulsive was not a show of strength. It often led to calamity. Hence Varus and his 3 legions, hence Julian and his rush to take Ctesiphon in Sasanian Persia, hence Valens and his rush to stop the Visigoths and having his entire army wiped out along with him. So the Romans knew how to deliberately prosecute a campaign. And what's the best example? Trajan. Domitian had not been able to defeat the king of the Dacians, and Trajan had to undertake several campaigns. It took time. Now, Americans talk about news cycles, and that means, or that speaks to rather, the very short time frame that Americans occupy. They live in the moment. If something doesn't happen right away, well, why didn't it happen? It's a failure. Whereas the Russians prosecute a war not according to the news cycle every day. They're in it for the long haul. They want to win. And they are, in that sense, much like Romans. So Putin hasn't done anything about Kursk because it's not only irrelevant in terms of the strategic picture and prosecution of the war, it also helps the Russian cause, because the United States has supported an invasion of Russia, which we haven't seen the likes of, at least in these narrow terms, metaphorical terms, since World War II. So it helps Russia, it helps it with the BRICS, and it helps Russia in its desire to avoid negotiations. And so it can say, how can we negotiate with such faithless people who were negotiating with us and then invaded us? Also, Russians can see the incredible progress they're making in destroying the Ukrainian army and the breakthrough that I know is going to happen before the election, because the erosion of the Ukrainian fortified front in the Donbass is now cracking. And the fact that it appears to news cycle Americans that, oh, you said it was cracking last week. You said that the week before, a month ago, 6 months ago. Well, this is the way you win a war. The Romans didn't take Dacia in a day. Oh, we're spoiled. We're spoiled even by memories of the fall of France and the like. It takes time. And that time is what Russia has taken to put itself in a position where I think it will own the whole Ukraine situation before the election. And that is critical for blue in the sense that, A, they cannot bring Russia to negotiations and put things off until after the election. And B, all of their attempts to restrain Ukraine have failed. All of their attempts to keep Ukraine going seem to be failing now. And Zelensky has entered into one of the worst strategic death traps since the Battle of the Bulge.
Detail about the perception in Moscow of strength. Russia wants to win, and I don't know the timeline, but at this point, is this a civil war? Because in civil wars, there's usually a resolution at the end. Usually. Or is it a war of invasion? We have both models here.
Yeah, it's several layers of war. It is in many deep ways a civil war, and that civil war can be solved, but it won't be solved to either side's satisfaction. I mean, Ukraine, the Ukrainians that dominate, that is, are the kind of Ukrainians who joined up enthusiastically with the Wehrmacht in the Great Patriotic War. The other half or more of Ukrainians speak Russian, and they want to be Russian, most of them, well, most of that half. And so it is a civil war, and yet with the intervention of NATO, it has become a much bigger struggle. And the echoes for Russians, any thinking Russian is going to think back to Napoleon, and even farther back than that to Charles the 12th. The Charles the 12th was defeated at Poltava. Well, guess where the Russians are going to be as soon as they take Pokrovsk? They're going to be in Poltava. And of course, with the Ukrainians sporting all this Nazi regalia and wearing Stahlhelms and boasting and speaking German in their Stahlhelms and putting it up on Twitter, doesn't help their cause. The Russians are determined to win, and of course, their history, not unlike the Romans, is a history of long struggles that they eventually triumph over implacable enemies, over, the Teutonic Knights, the Mongols. It's a long history of struggle, and Russians are a determined people. Let's just put it that way.
Rome's victories were based upon removing the enemy from contest forever. That's what the victories were based on. Not negotiation, but victory. And the sort of thing the Mongols were good at 1,000 years later. You roll up, you throw heads over the wall, and you wait for them to surrender. Okay. America's 3 years since Afghanistan. What have they learned? There is bitterness in the legions, Germanicus. I've heard it in podcasts. The word betrayal is used, and they're not wrong. No. They have friends. They've spent years getting friends out of Afghanistan. They have death lists of the Taliban executed families. And they're articulate young people. They're very well educated. They're not yet in politics in great numbers, but they will be the Congress. And they want the general officers and the political voices of those years, 2001 to 2021. They want them to come forward and say, it wasn't you, it was us. And they're not hearing it. Now that sense of betrayal can only get worse. Rome has a version, and the American Empire used it in 1945, but not since. Do we know why?
The United States is, like all societies, evolving. And as it has evolved, there has been the comforting uh, uh, the comforting vision of things staying the same, of continuity, that we were still the same kind of America, and yet at some point we accreted enough change that we ceased to be rather the republic that we once were, that could fight wars, even short wars like World War I, but really long, bloody wars like the American Civil War, and much less so World War II. But World War II did have that truly dark side to it, especially in the first years. And the America that emerged by the 1960s was not attuned to the kind of sacrifice and commitment that society had been. And we know that because we know how things turned out in Vietnam. And Nixon had to trot out peace, peace with honor. And that was extremely weak. It was not Roman. And then our departure from Vietnam, after essentially abandoning all the Vietnamese who had been committed to us for so long, we simply left behind. And our departure was not only dishonorable, it was shameful. And we have not been able to regain the qualities that we had in World War II because that we don't have that kind of society. And so what the military did was it was able to exercise a sleight of hand, not only by creating an all-volunteer force, for which casualties would be slightly less disheartening, but also it created a vision, a fantasy. I call it a sleight of hand, a misdirection, but nonetheless a conjuring trick that was showcased in Desert Storm, in which the emperor and his court could sell the American people on easy victory, easy, quick victory with almost no casualties. And that was tried again after Desert Storm in 2001, and it seemed to work in Afghanistan and then in Iraq, but it didn't last and things fell apart. And in the absence of a quick victory, the entirety of our military and the entirety of all the courtiers in the imperial city could not come up with a real strategy because there was only one in those circumstances, and that would be a return to Roman values and Roman virtues. We could not bring ourselves to do that. The departure from Afghanistan was just as shameful, if not more shameful, than our departure from Vietnam, because we were in a position where we could choose and manage the nature of our departure. And instead, we ended up falling apart just as we had in 1975. And the next disaster will be the collapse of Ukraine and the realization that the United States sacrificed an entire society for its own vanity and failed. So there is worse yet ahead. And the only way for the US to return to the kind of authority it had in World War II and before would be for there to be a transformation, a revolution in American society. And yet we see things moving in the opposite direction because we have at this point wholly abandoned the heroic society, which was the essence of Roman society. And we have adopted a therapeutic ethos. And the therapeutic ethos is all about safety, and it's all about comfort and and feeling safe, just feeling unthreatened. And that kind of society is incapable of prosecuting the kind of military campaign that was absolutely necessary to fulfill Rome's ambitions. And if our ambitions, as Biden has said again and again, are to be the world leader, then it's simply impossible to fulfill those ambitions any longer. And there's going to be a reckoning. And reckoning is upon us. It's happening right now.
Quick story. In 1943, Churchill again arrived at the White House to visit with the president and plan what we know now to be Overlord. However, it was 43. It was the spring of 43, May. And they were going to spend a few days at what we call Camp David. Roosevelt called it Shangri-La, the camp outside. It's a drive because they didn't have a helicopter. It's quite some drive out of Washington. And Churchill and the president and the first lady were in the armored limousine. First lady wanted to sit in front with the chauffeur, and Churchill said, "I forbid it. The British Empire forbids it. You sit here with your husband," and he's got in front. So they passed through Fredericktown, and he recalled the poem by Whittier, I believe, John Greenleaf Whittier, about rebels coming through town on their way to a battle and shooting up an American flag that was flying from a house. He recalled the poem perfectly. And everybody was impressed, even though he didn't get it perfect. It had been 40 years since he read it, but he could recall it and tell the story. And nobody said anything was out of order. That was just who they were. That's the spring of 43. What is that, Michael? That's 80 years ago, right?
Yes.
Yeah. It's gone.
It is gone. You know, on Twitter, this is just an anecdotal response and reinforcement to what you said. On Twitter, there are constant posts that say, "What movie do you remember before 1970?" And then the others are tests, like, if you recognize this actor, you're my friend. And the actor is always some guy our age who was in the movies in the 60s and 70s. And the world, the old heroic world is gone, and the efforts of the therapeutic ethos are to wipe its memory from our mind, just like damnatio imperio, to wipe the image of the last emperor away in order to reinforce the legitimacy of the new emperor. So the therapeutic ethos wants to wipe away all memory of the heroes that we once were.
Germanicus, Vlahos, Gaius, John Batchelor, Londinium, a pleasant afternoon far from the troubles in Rome. Domitian will come to a very sad end. Nerva will come to a very sad end. Trajan, however, has a good run, and Hadrian has a better run. Their army never betrayed, not in the first 2 centuries. This is the Friends of History Debating Society. I'm John Batchelor.